Welcome, everyone, to our latest Decoding China series, Talking Chinese Politics, Eyes on the 2020 Political Transition. Today, we're going to listen in on a discussion between MacroPolo experts Damien Ma and Neil Thomas about the rising stars and emerging trends to watch in Chinese elite politics over the next 2 years. We're going to close this discussion with 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A, so please add your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So today's conversation is rooted in Thomas's recent report, Eye on 2022 Rising Stars in Beijing. This report's now available on the MacroPolo website, and we encourage you all to read this two-part series and other compelling articles from our team of experts at MacroPolo. So now I'd like to introduce you to our panel. First off is Damien Ma. Damien is the director and co-founder of MacroPolo, the in-house think tank at the Paulson Institute, and Neil Thomas is a senior research associate at MacroPolo. Working with the MacroPolo team, Neil conducts research on and covers US-China policies, the Chinese political economy, as well as the global economy. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists. But first, we are actually going to start with a poll. So let me pull that up for everyone so everyone can participate. And this question is, will Xi Jinping still be the leader of China in 2035? And I'll give everyone a few seconds to take the poll. And then I'll let Damien take over from there. Okay. And here's what we have. Damien, can you see this?
I can. Wow, who's the 1% that doesn't care? All right, well,
sure.
Seems like a big. So most of you think that he will not be here by 2035, which is 15 years from now. So I guess he wouldn't have a fifth term, so to speak. Well, anyway, thank you, Kristen, for the great introduction, and I'm delighted to be here with my colleague Neil. To just really chat about Chinese politics for the next half an hour or so. And it's a really opportune time to do so. As I think many of you are aware, the National People's Congress, or the two sessions, are starting tonight, US time, and obviously tomorrow morning, Beijing time. And usually you'll have the usual State of the Republic address from Premier. And it's also just a good occasion to see all the top politicians in one place. And so this is a very good time to be talking about politics and who's who in politics. So where I want to begin is really going, talking about what Neil has written about in quite detailed fashion over the last a few months in the two-part series, which I think we looked at. Both who are the prospects heading into 2022. And for those of you who don't know, 2022 is sort of the major political transition coming up for China. And China were to have political campaigns, we will be seeing them right now. This would be campaign season. Of course, it's not a democratic polity. It doesn't have actual political campaigns. So the two ways to really gauge what's happening in Chinese politics is looking at policy or personnel. And so today we're going to be looking really much more on the personnel side, because we want to identify who might be the next cohort or the so-called rising stars. So Neil, you divided your series into kind of people in the provinces, those are people away from the center, and then followed up with people in the center. So let's start with people away from the center. Why provinces? Why do they matter? And why do we care who's the party secretary of what province?
Thanks, Damien. And it's great to be having this conversation with everyone. Yeah, I think provinces are important because traditionally provincial leadership, and especially being the party secretary of a province, which is the number one leader compared to the number two, who's the governor, the leader of the state. Being a party secretary of a province has traditionally been the most important route for emerging leaders at the national level. So those leaders who go on to get a seat on the 25-member Politburo, or even the 7-member Politburo Standing Committee, which is the top leadership body in the entire Chinese Communist Party. So it has a lot of power that attaches to it. So that's why provincial leadership is a particularly important part of the system to be paying attention to. And it's important to be paying attention to now because usually it's, in the 1 or 2 years leading up to these big, party congresses, which only happen every 5 years and which select the new central committee. It's promotions during that time that tend to give you a pretty good indication of who is in political favor and who is well placed to be making some kind of jump or some kind of promotion, possibly to the Politburo at that party congress. So looking at the promotions that have happened over about the last 12 to 15 months, I found that there are 10 of the China's provincial level governments got new party secretaries in 2020. So that's about 1 in every 3 roughly. And these provinces, right, are huge places. Guangdong, Shandong, Zhejiang have anywhere from like 80 to 120 million people in them. Their economies are larger than entire countries that are significant members of the world stage or the European Union. So they're important figures, especially in those localities, and that can get lost a little bit if we're only thinking about Xi Jinping and what Xi Jinping is doing. He's obviously important, but it's worth keeping an eye on these rising stars and emerging leaders.
So on the provincial aspect, if you think about, let's draw an analog to the United States, you have certain states that tend to be perhaps more politically powerful, so to speak, or in part because they're economically more dynamic, their bigger economies, more populous. With the 2020 promotions, just kind of eyeballing it, do you see any sort of is there a concentration of in specific like regional areas that may have gained a little bit more power versus some other regions, or is that kind of too soon to tell?
I think in terms of the regional question, it's a little bit all over the place. I think something that is significant is that regions that have faced particularly difficult circumstances. I'm thinking especially here of Hubei, which obviously Wuhan was the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak. So where provinces have run into some trouble, we've seen Xi Jinping look to put people close to himself into those positions. The party secretary of Hubei province, Zhang Chaoliang, at the time of the outbreak was purged, was demoted. He no longer holds a position. That happened in, I think, March of 2020. Anyway, shortly after the outbreak and the eventually successful response to lock down Wuhan and to at least get rid of the virus, whatever else may have happened. So after that happened, Xi Jinping parachuted an ally called Ying Yong, who was serving as the mayor of Shanghai, into that position, and was widely seen as an effort to have someone there that was trusted, who Xi Jinping could rely on to manage the response to this crisis, which had potentially huge political legitimacy implications. To have someone there close to him who could manage that and be trusted to very faithfully implement the Xi's ideas for what should happen there.
So on the Shanghai question, that got me thinking. There was a time not too long ago in previous administrations, and particularly back in Jiang Zemin, there was always sort of this talk of, each top leader had their own power bases, right? Hu Jintao supposedly had his power base in kind of central China and so on, and a little further out west. And Jiang Zemin obviously was associated with the Shanghai power base. Now, we all know Xi Jinping spent only 10 months, 7, 8, 10 months, right, in Shanghai as party secretary. But it seems from what you've been writing on that he's gotten quite a number of sort of Shanghai people into higher levels of power. Explain. Is there a bit of a Shanghai dynamic going on there that you can tell from what Xi Jinping's been doing?
Yeah, I think the Shanghai case is really interesting because, as many people in the school probably know, Shanghai was the power base of former leader Jiang Zemin. He rose up through the Shanghai bureaucracy there and kind of went straight from being Shanghai leader to being the general secretary of the Communist Party following 1989. So he went on in the next 10, 15 years as he served as general secretary, promoting and elevating people that he knew from his time in Shanghai that, were trusted colleagues of his, people like Wu Bangguo, Jia Qinglin, and many others, to the extent that the Politburo Standing Committee that Jiang's successor, Hu Jintao, inherited was stacked full of these members of the so-called Shanghai Gang, people who were, generally seen as loyal to Jiang Zemin, and who, at many points, blocked reform measures or got in the way of things that Hu Jintao wanted to do that were against their interests. And a lot of these people are still around. They're still alive. They may have retired from formal politics. They may not be on the Politburo Standing Committee anymore. But traditionally, retired leaders have been quite influential in China. Jiang is still alive. He's in his 90s now, but he still has a potential to be a kind of power broker or kingmaker. And I think very early in his term, Xi Jinping kind of identified that as a potential constraint, a potential threat to his own personal authority in the leadership. And so he's tried to make Shanghai kind of one of his own power bases, which is an interesting way to, kind of new to the influence of Jiang in throughout Chinese politics. So he has, promoted an unusually large number of people he worked with for, as you're saying, just that short 10 months. And two in particular stand out. So Xi Jinping's chief of staff, Ding Xuexiang, worked under him in Shanghai in 2007. So Ding is, on the Politburo. He was promoted from being an alternate member of the Central Committee. So, perhaps being one of the top 250 to 370 leaders to being one of the top 25, which is very unusual. And also Yang Xiaodu, who is the head of the new National Supervision Commission, which is a new institution that came about in the 2018 government reforms and plays a central role in formalizing and making permanent Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign as a kind of tool of governance.
Yeah, that guy was the anti-corruption cop, right? He's like the top anti-corruption cop, basically, Yang Xiaodu, right?
One of them, yes.
Yeah.
And he was promoted from outside the Central Committee, so outside the top 370 leaders, right onto the Politburo, the top 25 leaders, which is extremely rare. It hadn't happened since 1992 in the kind of post-Tiananmen rearrangements in Chinese politics.
And of course, Han Zheng is current. He was the former party secretary of Shanghai, and he's sitting on the standing committee today. So so there's the Shanghai dynamic that I find quite interesting. Another thing that I don't know if you've noticed, back during Xi's first term, I was kind of tracking just casually, at every NPC, the top leader tends to visit. After the formal meeting, they visit the various delegations from different provinces and regions, and I was tracking it through most of his first term and a little bit in his second term, and without fail, I think he's always visited the Inner Mongolian delegates, and so I was always wondering, what was it about Inner Mongolia that was so special? I was like, was Xi Jinping into coal or rare earths or something like that? But I found out actually, Xi Zhongxun, the Xi family is actually very close to the founding party chairman of Inner Mongolia. That was an interesting thing I did not know about. So I think there's always a fondness for Inner Mongolia. And if you've seen some over the years, or last few years, at least Xinhua's done some random, just big spreads on Inner Mongolia. And I always found that to be very, why of 30 or so provinces and regions, why Inner Mongolia? So that's an interesting, quite interesting dynamic. But going back to Ding Xuexiang a little bit, so who do we think who has the potential to be the next chief of staff?
Yeah, I think Ding Xuexiang is a really interesting person to watch because he's the one of the youngest members of the Politburo. I think he's the second youngest behind Hu Junhua. He'll be 60 in 2022 at the changeover, and age is significant here because traditionally there's been an informal test for whether someone could stay on the Politburo Standing Committee. So if you had turned 68 that year, you were too old and you would be made to retire. If you were 67 or younger, then you would be informally eligible for another term. And that since about 1992, the Party Congress that year, that's generally been seen as a pretty strong norm of Chinese politics. And it's notable that even at the 19th Party Congress, which was widely seen as a kind of coronation of Xi Jinping as the leader for life of China, or as perhaps the most powerful leader since Deng or even Mao, a real triumph of Xi Jinping in Chinese politics. That those age norms were still observed. Close allies like Wang Qishan, he left the Politburo Standing Committee. He's still influential. He's the vice president of China, but still there was that constraint. So, I mean, apart from perhaps the case of Xi himself, which maybe we'll talk about in more detail later, I think the expectation is that those age norms will probably hold for other people in the political system. So we will see people retiring, which means that being young is still an advantage for future promotion prospects, potentially. So Ding is very young. He's obviously worked extremely closely with Xi Jinping, first in Shanghai, but not that long after he was brought to Beijing, and he's kind of risen through the ranks of the kind of really top secretaries, if you like. So he was the deputy to Zhao Ji in terms of managing Xi Jinping's personal office and the office of the Central Committee leaders. So obviously an extremely powerful role in the internal workings of the party. And so he's been in that position. He will be in that position for 5 years come 2022. He's young. He seems to be very close to Xi. And so he has the potential to perhaps be promoted to an even higher position. And if that does happen, then that'll obviously create an opening on the Politburo. And it seems like that will probably be filled by someone who was promoted just towards the end of last year, a politician or cadre by the name of Meng Xiangfeng. If he does, if Ding does move on and Meng then moves up to become from deputy to become head of the party's general office, then he'll be basically almost guaranteed a seat on the next Politburo.
All right. Well, you guys heard it here first. Watch this guy Meng, and follow his prospects. So let's move.
Both have a lot of potential to upward movement.
But who the next chief of staff? For those who don't, who may not know, but the chief of staff or the party's general office is a very powerful position, obviously. Let's move from the periphery or the provinces to the center a little bit. Just talk a little bit about some of the promotions and some of the changes in the bureaucracy and also party agencies. I think we all know that under Xi Jinping, the state bureaucracy has certainly weakened in terms of its power and its influence. Certainly the National Development and Reform Commission, as I think people might be aware, was considered a mini state council back in the day under Hu Jintao, under Hu and Wen, but now it's basically more of a shadow of its former self. So how should we interpret the promotions at the state level? Are they going to be, in terms of relative influence, are the people being promoted in the provinces now going to be more important vis-a-vis the people that are being promoted in the center?
Yeah, so in terms of how state council ministers and people who've come up mainly through the government bureaucracy have fared, from what we've seen so far at least, the trend has been toward less influence and kind of more favor on people who've come up through perhaps the party bureaucracy, but especially the provinces who have actual very close experience of local governance. So I mean, the one kind of headline statistic I pulled about this was that 5 members of Xi Jinping's first Politburo, the 18th Politburo, had been state council ministers, full ministers before, whereas that was only 3 for the 19th Politburo. And in these small elite groupings, that kind of number of people changing doesn't seem a lot, but it's quite significant given how there's usually a fairly settled pattern in how the roles are distributed. So that's a fairly significant sign that people who have spent their entire careers in Beijing are kind of viewed less favorably for those most senior leadership positions. And in terms of the promotions, I mean, what the pattern that's really come through in looking at who has in the last 12 to 18 months been elevated to more senior positions within the state bureaucracy, potentially something that might lead to the turning around of that influence, is that so 6 of the 9 new cabinet ministers in that time have worked closely with either Xi himself or with close Xi allies who are now on the Politburo, and especially people who have been seen as quite close to Xi. Wang Qishan, saying Yang Xiaodu, Zhao Leji, who's another close ally, and who I should correct myself, actually. It wasn't him who was head of Xi Jinping's personal office. It was Li Jianshu before him. So a little correction there from my previous remarks. But yeah, we've seen people who have worked as deputies or as close understudies of key Xi allies. They've also begun to rise through the ranks, because obviously Xi Jinping has only worked with so many competent, trusted, and age-appropriate people for these promotions. So it's natural that there'd be a bit of a spreading of the net in terms of bringing on and elevating people who Xi's allies consider their own kind of allies or proteges, and who can kind of be brought into that wider and growing network. So
what happened? So what happened to the technocrats? There was a time where supposedly there were just tons and tons of technocrats, at the elite levels. But so what happened to that group?
I think technocrats really had a huge moment where a lot of them got promoted, especially around the kind of administration of Hu Jintao, who was himself a technocrat. He was a highly trained engineer, as was Jiang before him. So probably began under Jiang, really. And that was just really so prominent because it was so different from the kind of previous model for a successful Chinese politician, which was kind of during the Mao era, or even in the decade or two after Mao died in '76. Those were still the most powerful people. They were revolutionaries who had fought against the nationalists or the Japanese, or had kind of come up through the internecine struggles of being redder than expert during the Mao era, as the saying went. So there was just a huge kind of change in the party's recruitment of new elites and new leaders as it turned towards economic development, and these types of skills were increasingly valuable and essential for China's future. So I think technocrats are still very much around. That they're certainly not dead politically, and we can see that if we kind of turn back a little bit to the provincial promotions. There were 3 technocrats who were so-called parachuted into governorships over the last year. One of those is probably with the best prospects is Li Ganjie, who is the governor of Shandong. He's only 58 in 2022, so pretty young by the standards of Chinese elite politics, and he's a highly trained nuclear scientist who has worked in senior technocratic positions, and is now in a provincial leadership position, and had previously served as the state council minister. So that's also a pretty unusual move to go from a ministership back into provincial leadership at a very high level. So him, people like Mao Wei-ming, people like Han Jun, and a few others as well, all seem to be on the up in Chinese politics. So I think it's certainly not over in terms of the value of technocrats, but perhaps it's just less prominent compared to that sea change we saw.
Now, wasn't there something interesting about the aerospace industry? Speaking of technocrats, were there a number of kind of prominent promotions from that industry? Is that because of COMAC, or I remember seeing that? If you could kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. So in terms of within that sphere of technocracy, what we're seeing is those technocrats who are being promoted are those who have experience within particularly the aerospace industry. So people like Zhang Guoqing, Xu Daizhe, Yuan Jiajun, all new governors in the last year. So the signal that this is kind of being seen to sending to the system is that, Xi Jinping wants to promote people who have experience in the industries, particularly those apex industries like aerospace, that are going to be important for China's development of an independent innovation ecosystem, which we've seen, being flagged as a major part, major pillar, is the words of the next 5-year plan. There's also an overlap with Xi Jinping's civil military fusion plan, which is, a fairly major program to, improve the technological capabilities and the industry input into China's development of military technologies. And one particularly important person for that is a new ministerial level deputy at the National Development and Reform Commission, who could very well take over from the current chair, He Lifeng, who's also a Xi ally, and that's Tang Dongjie, who started last year. He worked with Xi actually in Shanghai, so yet another example of Xi's new Shanghai gang coming to the fore. So he used to work for a couple of decades, all up in his early career as an executive at state-owned, firstly automotive companies. So obviously building a domestic car industry has long been a goal of China. It's still very much dominated by foreign players, but that's one priority. But also he worked in the state-owned armaments company, one of the big ones, China South Industries. I think China South or China North, I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But anyway, one of the major suppliers of armaments to the PLA. So his elevation potentially to the National Development and Reform Commission leadership, perhaps in 2022, he's definitely one of the front runners, because He Lifeng will most likely retire. That elevation could be a huge signal that civil military fusion is here to stay. It's only going to become a more important and more central tenet of China's industrial development.
So let me ask a bit of more of a broader question. Now that we've kind of looked at the promotions over last year, obviously we're coming to the tail end of Xi Jinping's second term. Obviously, I think whatever happens in 2022 will be really important in kind of reinforcing, how we think about Chinese elite politics under Xi. But with roughly 2 terms behind us, how should we be thinking about kind of Chinese elite politics? Because as you know, for a while there was always the kind of the factional dueling model, in terms of Communist Youth League, had its own people, and there was internal competition versus kind of the princelings. Obviously, Xi Jinping himself is considered a princeling, but what happened to that dynamic? And should we be thinking about other variables and factors when we're trying to think broadly about Chinese elite politics and where it's going?
Yeah, I think the way that factions have manifested in Chinese politics has kind of tracked the division of power between the major leaders. So previously, a fairly decent approximation of what was happening in Chinese politics was provided, I think, by this model of different factions associated with different top leaders. So as you were saying, Jiang Zemin's Shanghai gang, Hu Jintao's the Communist Youth League, the Tuanpai, or most associated with Hu Jintao's, its most prominent product, and arguably a separate princeling faction, which Xi Jinping would have been a part of. I think that situation of many factions associated with different leaders has kind of morphed into a situation where we have many factions associated with the one leader, Xi Jinping. Ties to Xi and his allies seem to be a pretty important factor in terms of who's being promoted across different parts of the Chinese system at this elite ministerial and above level. But we do have different parts of Xi Jinping's life, career, interests that these people have come from. So there are princelings like Wang Qishan, who is the son-in-law of a high-level leader in the Deng era, Yao Yilin. Liu He's father was a kind of middling official and they knew each other from their childhoods in Beijing. Also people like Li Shi and Zhang Youxia, who are kind of slightly less powerful Politburo members, who are kind of family associates. We're not entirely clear how it all happened, but they appear to be quite close to Xi and also perhaps his father from many decades ago. Then we have people that Xi got to know in Shanxi or through his family connections to Shanxi province, like Zhao Leji, who's on the standing committee, Wang Chen, who's a leader at the MPC. Then we also have people he knows from his days at Tsinghua, particularly Chen Shi, who is the head of the organization department, which is an incredibly powerful institution. It's the HR department of the Communist Party, right? And it has a huge role to play in selecting who fills new leadership posts. And there are a few other people like the mayors of Beijing and Tianjin, both came up through the Tsinghua bureaucracy too. Li Jianshu is a little bit of an interesting one. He worked right in an adjoining county in Hubei very early in Xi Jinping's career. But kind of the major grouping of people who've been elevated under Xi, apart from the new Shanghai gang, if you like, is a grouping known as the new Zhejiang army. So people that Xi Jinping worked with in Zhejiang, but also Fujian when he was the provincial leader in both those provinces, who's governor and then party secretary of Zhejiang. So people like Chen Minna, he's often touted as a potential successor, though I'm not sure if that word is right to describe other powerful leaders in the Xi Jinping era. Cai Qi, Huang Kunming, both worked with Xi Jinping in Zhejiang and Fujian, and enjoyed skip level promotions to the Politburo from being alternates beforehand. Li Qiang, who is mayor of Shanghai, party secretary of Shanghai. So obviously, he's been put in there. He knows Xi Jinping from his days in Zhejiang, and he's been put now in Shanghai to kind of keep fostering Xi's own influence in what's traditionally Jiang Zemin's power base. So this new Zhejiang army, that's the most, the biggest grouping, and also in terms of who's been elevated, who's kind of worked with allies of Xi rather than with Xi himself, it tends to be people who've worked with new Zhejiang army members. So there's these different groupings, and we don't exactly know how they relate to each other within the context of we see associates and allies of Xi Jinping in the system. So something to watch in terms of what happens at the 2022 Party Congress is who amongst people seen as being close to or allies or associates of Xi, who amongst them is promoted.
So I think we can talk about, and we can have another 3 hours and talk about this, but this is actually a really good way to end, so we can get to Q&A. People who have questions. Just a quick yes or no, given that the earlier poll showed the majority says Xi Jinping's not going to be around by 2035. So, to the best of your guess, in 2022, yes or no, are we going to see heir apparents?
At 2022.
Yes.
I think it's going to be interesting. Well, yeah, a classic kind of
rapid answer.
response. Yeah, it is important to note that, I don't think anyone has the inside track on.
But your best guess, are we going to start to see a more clear view of the heir apparents in 2022?
Let's briefly set out the kind of the thought process, because Xi Jinping either looks to younger people in his circle who are already on the Politburo, because even the consistent trend has been that every standing committee member is a Politburo member previously, and it's the standing committee elevations that are generally seen as what's important for the next generation of leaders. If you're a young leader who makes the Politburo standing committee, then you're going to be seen no matter what as a potential successor or part of the next generation of leadership. So Xi Jinping may decide that that's something he doesn't want to establish. So he might not elevate someone like Chen Minna, because that's going to anoint Chen as a potential successor. That's the vision that will be seen of him. So that could be a potential political threat. So that's something to think about in terms of these generally accepted ideas of who is going to go up and down. So there's a possibility that she just decides to promote older allies, most likely, who are going to be age limited out of the Politburo Standing Committee by the time of the 21st Party Congress, when Xi Jinping perhaps will seek to stay in power for even longer. So it's an open question. I think we just going from past practice, I think it possibly is likely that one or two younger people will get promoted. There's only 2 of the current 7 members, aside from Xi Jinping, of the Standing Committee who are due to retire based on age grounds alone in 2022. So it's definitely a space to watch.
All right, so thanks, Kristen, for the final poll. It's also kind of predicting, or thinking about 2022. The final question was, how many new members of the Standing Committee will there be in 2022? And it sounds like it's a pretty close tie for 4 or 5. So we think, well, they're pretty close. They're all 4, 5, or 6, 8. Obviously, that's that's not going to happen unless they go back to 9, which seems very unlikely. So 4 seems to be slightly edged out, which means people think 3 people, obviously Xi Jinping, but 2 other people in addition to Xi will stay on the Standing Committee. So that's an interesting response, and we will see. And we're actually going to be doing a lot of work in that regard as well. So stay tuned, and we're going to be thinking a lot about not just the Standing Committee, but also the Politburo in general. So keep up with our work, and we hopefully we'll see who's right in about 1.5 years. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kristen.
On mute. Thank you for joining us. We're going to open this up to Q&A right now. So Damien, are you able to see the questions? Otherwise, I can list them off for everyone. And before we start the questions, I actually just wanted to make sure I've put into the chat to follow us on social media, both at the Paulson Institute and MacroPolo. And also visit the website, macropolo.org, for more content on China's economic arrival. There's great stuff there. Before we get to these questions, I do want to let you know, if you do have additional questions, Neil is going to be available on Twitter after this webinar. So please follow us on the Paulson Institute to interact with us some more. So thanks again. And let's have Damien get to some of these questions now.
Okay, I think we have like 10, and we unfortunately we can only select a few. And of course, if we don't, like Kristen said, you can catch us on Twitter, and we can have another discussion on there. So let me see. Here's a fairly easy one that we can talk about. Neil, are any of the rising stars women? The sole female member of the current Politburo is Chen Chunlan, which is that is correct. So were there any female rising stars in the recent promotions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, there is one. And there is one because, I mean, the broader issue is that there's generally a kind of tokenism about female representation on the Politburo. There's generally been 1, occasionally 2 women, and each time one of those hits retirement age, which is 68 for people on who can't make the Standing Committee, they are replaced by another woman. So the current female member of the Politburo, Sun Chunlan, will be 72, I think, in 2022. So perhaps 70. Anyway, well past the retirement age for officials of her rank. So I think the most likely replacement is Shen Yiqian, who was promoted to be party secretary of Guizhou, her native province, in last year. She'll be 63 in 2022. So, well in the range of people, eligible for promotion to the Politburo, not due to retire from her position until 65 at least, unless she's further promoted. So she is the only female leader of a province, the only female party secretary of a province, which is quite significant, as she's actually only the third female provincial party secretary in the post-Mao era. So quite a rare club. And the reason why I think that is particularly significant for a potential Politburo promotion is that Sun Chunlan, before she was promoted to the Politburo, she was also the second ever female provincial party secretary. So there's precedent there in terms of which of the more senior females in the party state system gets promoted. There is a higher ranking female leader, the chair of the All China Women's Federation, who's also a vice chair of the NPC Standing Committee. That's Shen Yueyue. But she has been in the same position since 2013 and hasn't seen the type of elevation or political favor that that Shen Yiqin seems to be enjoying at the moment. Shen Yiqin's also slightly younger, which is to her advantage, and I think her position as one of these rare female party secretaries of a province means that she is in pretty good stead to replace Sun Chunlan when Sun retires.
So another one of those personnel questions that I think is interesting, but perhaps a little bit harder to tell right now without reading tea leaves. But one of the questions is, who do we think could potentially be premier after Li Keqiang?
Yeah, the premier question is extremely interesting.
Does Ding Xuexiang have a shot? Is it maybe it's Hu Chunhua? What do we think?
Yeah, so that goes to the previous discussion we're having about what's the thinking amongst the leadership about the next Politburo Standing Committee in terms of balancing, do we promote younger people with a view to them being successors in the future, in the next 10, 15 years, or given it seems that she potentially wants to stay as paramount leader for the next at least 5, perhaps 15 years to 2035, maybe they'll go with kind of more trusted, older politicians who are seen as being likely to retire in 5 years' time and not be around as potential people in a position to succeed Xi. So I think Li Keqiang will obviously leave the position. He's term limited. There's an interesting side question about whether he will stay on the Politburo Standing Committee because he's 67 in 2022, so he's eligible age-wise to stay around. And he's not that close with Xi, but he's done a reasonable job actually in a lot of these administrative reforms and kind of cleaning up some of the state and business bureaucracy. But anyway, in terms of the actual question of premier, if they go for experience and they go for not wanting to elevate a young rising star to this kind of the stratosphere of Chinese politics, then someone like Wang Yang, who is has been like in the state system quite a lot. He is seen as a bit more of a reformer, but he hasn't got especially strong ties, we don't think, to alternative power centers. Yes, he was kind of high up in the Communist Youth League, but that hasn't been a major part of his career or movements over the last 10, 15 years. He's been a senior provincial leader and is currently the head of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which just had opened its plenary session yesterday, Beijing time. So he's a likely candidate. He's a lot of experience with governing, with the kind of issues that a premier, who heads the state council, would be dealing with. So he's certainly a contender. Potentially, if there's a feeling amongst Xi and his closest advisors that Wang Yang is perhaps not as politically reliable as they would like because he's not as close to Xi, then you could potentially see someone like Zhao Leji, who's going to be 65 and staying around in 2022, who's someone that Xi seems quite a close advisor to Xi, that he could be elevated to that role. He's currently head of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, so heading the anti-corruption campaign, basically. So if that could be a potential route for him, given that anti-corruption is kind of morphed into this more general focus on policy execution and making sure that local cadres faithfully implement the will of the center. That's kind of the expanded remit of what started as an anti-corruption discipline campaign, and has become a really prominent part of how Xi Jinping governs China. So I think Zhao Leji is in the mix, although the premier traditionally has come from someone who's been a vice premier. So it's Wang Yang and Hu Junhua are the options from that traditional route, but neither of them is seen as particularly close to Xi. And Hu Junhua also kind of came up through was the leader of the Communist Youth League a few decades ago. So it's I think with Wang Yang and Zhao Leji are kind of the two frontrunners and represent these two different models of what the premier might look like.
Okay, well, in the interest of time, I think we have time for one more question, and I want to pick one that I think that we don't get that often, but I think is quite interesting to think about, which is how and why should subnational governments in the United States build relationships with certain rising stars in Chinese politics, provinces, subnational leaders in China. And I think that's an interesting question because you have two very large countries that are actually fairly decentralized in reality, in practice. Although Beijing and Washington get a lot of attention, many things happen at the provincial and also at the state level. So how does it benefit state U.S. state legislators or governments to understand more about Chinese provinces, provincial rising stars, et cetera, and how to engage? Which I think is a pretty interesting question. And I can take a shot at that too, but I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Sure, yeah, I can give some brief thoughts. It's something, probably a question you have more experience with, Damien, in terms of answering. I think that, it's hugely important if, your goal is to, say, build a factory like the Tesla factory in Shanghai, or to, to enter a certain provincial market, or to, foster some kind of city-to-city relationship, then yes, provincial leadership is the, obviously the next level down. It's a very powerful level of government still, and it's basically provincial leaders who come up with the implementation plans, if you like, for their provinces in terms of responding to the central directives and policy outcomes that are determined in Beijing. Obviously, many of some of the provincial leaders sit on the Politburo. So the leaders of Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Chongqing, as well as Guangdong, the huge manufacturing hub in southern China. So those are especially powerful provincial leaders. Anyway, any provincial party secretary or governor is on the same rank as a state council minister in terms of the administrative hierarchy of the Chinese government. So they're very powerful figures who very much have and advocate for their own kind of provincial interests, therefore their career interests in Chinese politics. So they're incredibly important people, but perhaps you also have some insights, Damien, from your experience.
Well, I'll just add very briefly a few points. I think it's actually very important to have more subnational connections, in part because mayors and governors, I think no matter what country you're coming from, especially US and China, they have many more things in common because they deal day to day with very similar problems, jobs, having investment, the environment, all sorts of issues. And I think I've seen when mayors from China and the United States talk, there's a common language no matter which country you're coming from. And there's also just frankly a lot of activity in with subnational governments. One example is obviously California has worked a lot with China and various provinces on climate change and other issues. They've been the most prominent, but other states have done that, have taken a leadership. And the other thing is, it's important to understand developments at the local level, because a lot of times there's feedback loops in terms of policy from the center back to the provinces and back and forth. So, Neil mentioned Tesla, but another example is a city of, Hefei in Anhui, which is capital of Anhui province, and they clearly have been trying to become, whether they'll succeed or not, trying to become one of the kind of the EV hubs of China. And that's a plan that they've been, that they've had for a long time. And that, so if you understand what's happening in Hefei down in Anhui, a lot of that, if those leaders start to go back into the center or get promoted, then they're going to carry a lot of that experience and policy experience. And you're going to understand how, a lot of the policies are actually being shaped and influenced in Beijing because of, what happened in Anhui and Hefei. So I think it's really important. And I think there's just like how it works here in the United States, that, policy in Washington is often, based on mediating interests in the different states and so on. And it's obviously somewhat different in China, but it's not that different in terms of the actual, practice of it. So I think we will just end it there. And if we, like we said, more questions, I think we're going to hop on Twitter for, 15 or 20 minutes, and we can continue that discussion. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you all very much. And Kristen.
Thank you all very much. The Twitter feed is in the chat, if you can see right there, and we'll see you there. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode or webinar of Decoding China, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.